talk a little bit about a petition that has been launched by a campaign group known as Falsely Accused Individuals for Reform. There is their acronym, and this is being spearheaded by Sir Cliff Richard, the radio presenter Paul Gambasini, and others, including Lord Grey, the former BBC Director General. Um, so basically, a little bit of context here. Cliff Richard famously now went through very lengthy ordeal in which he was accused of sexual abuse of minors, and this led to a BBC raid on his home, or rather a BBC scrutiny of his home, I should say, and his reputation in tatters, and eventually the BBC had to apologise to him. Now, Cliff Richard has spoken about sleepless nights, serious depression, and all sorts of other problems that have been associated with this, understandably. Um, for a public figure to be accused of something before they've even been charged, before they have even been found guilty in a court of law, I think that is a profoundly serious thing. So, Yasmin Alibi Brown has a piece in the Eye where she claims that this petition, it's so far got 19,000 signatures, and if they get to 100,000, it would go to Parliament. And I'll just say, for the record, I've signed that. It will go to Parliament to be debated. She claims that it's misguided, obdurate, and too self absorbed. Now, she starts her piece by claiming that she understands uh, that it's wrong what these men went through, and she sympathizes with them in that sense. But I think it's a bit phony on her part. She then goes on to say that Sir Cliff Richard and the other campaigners need to meet the silent victims, i.e., those who have been victims of sexual abuse, who don't get justice. I think she's conflating two issues here, and she's putting the onus on men who have been falsely accused to get justice for innocent victims. The truth is, they're both innocent. Innocent victims are obviously innocent. Um, but the onus shouldn't be on men who've been falsely accused to get justice. That's not their job. That is not their responsibility. And they have absolutely no need to feel any sort of shame or guilt ride over this. All they are trying to do is get some fairness in this. Um, I mean, you can argue that the victims of sexual abuse are let down, and I think there's a very strong argument to be made with that. We saw with the Savile scandal how a serial predator got away with so much for so long that disgusted the whole nation. But trying to get justice for victims and trying to ensure that there is more transparency in the system and more justice shouldn't be in opposition to, making an obvious point that there should be due process. If someone is named, even if they're cleared, that question mark, that stigma will always be there. Now, Yasmin Alibi Brown sort of pertains to claim that she understands that, but then she goes on to try and shame these men. And unfortunately, a lot of people read into this sort of thing and they'll think, oh, these guys are just being selfish. What about the victims? But I would argue they are also victims. I'm not saying it's the exact same sort of suffering, someone who's been molested versus someone who's been falsely accused, but they're both terrible things. They both deeply impact and change people's lives. So this sort of notion that, this is exactly what she says. Richard is undoubtedly suffering the aftershocks of the police investigation and media intrusions of 2014. He says he still has sleepless nights, feels he's in a hole, doesn't understand what's happening to him. This is exactly how unheard, silently suffering victims feel. I have met many of them. As Richard, he should. Why should he? Why? The onus is not on him to campaign for victims. And I really don't think that this petition is about trying to deny people justice. I don't think Cliff Richard or Paul Gambasini or any of the other people involved in this are trying to put up a barrier to justice. They're not trying to make it harder for victims to get justice. They're simply saying that is obviously unfair that someone has their name plastered all over the media before they've even been charged. And it's all very well saying, oh, but they're cleared in a court of law. There will be some people who will always, go to that question mark and think, oh, well, no smoke without fire. And we see this in the Oscars as well with the whole Me Too thing. There's been examples of actors being treated like pariahs because they have been accused of something. I find this very unsettling. I am pretty conservative when it comes to crime. I strongly believe in the need for justice. And as my next video will show, I've got strong views when justice isn't met. I can totally understand and sympathize with a victim of, for example, sexual abuse being furious and feeling let down that their perpetrator walks free. But that doesn't mean that innocent men don't have a right to raise issue to their situation. The two things shouldn't be in like if you support one, you're against the other. If you support innocent men having their names cleared and having a right to anonymity before being charged, that doesn't mean you're against justice. And let's look at some of the arguments for that. One of them is that a serial predator, someone like Savile, if they're named during the process, that could encourage other victims to come forward. Now, on the surface, this seems like a reasonable claim, but I think that can still be done after they have been charged, i.e., you have a suspect, they're charged with one particular offence, then they can be named, particularly if they're a public figure after the charge, and then victims of that person can think, yeah, he done that to me or she done that to me as well, and I'm going to come forward with these claims. But I don't think people should be named on allegations alone. I think the press has a responsibility to not smear people. We've seen examples in the past of the way the tabloids in particular have behaved. And sometimes they've ended up having to make groveling apologies, albeit halfway through the paper, because they have put a cloud over an innocent person. When that young woman was murdered in Bristol, Jo Yates, her landlord was not outright accused of the crime, but the likes of the Sun had reports like the Curious, and no, actually, I think it was the Daily Mail. They they cast him in such a way as to make him look suspicious. In the end, it turned out to be a young Dutch guy that was responsible for that. So I find it very, very troubling when someone is smeared before they've even been found guilty in a court of law. I think Me Too embodies this. This is one of my main issues with Me Too as a movement. You see these actors being accused left, right, and center, and I'm not saying they're innocent. I'm saying let's have due process. Put them on trial. Let's see the evidence. And if they're guilty, they should face consequences. But this situation of stigmatizing people, shaming people before they've even appeared in a court of law just strikes me as incredibly wrong. Just wrong. I think that victims can get justice, for example, in the case of serial predators, um, after that person has been named, after they've been charged. If they're a public figure and they're charged with something, I think that's legitimate. That's, Celebrity A has been charged with this. I think that is legitimate reporting. But saying Celebrity A has had these allegations against them, I think there needs to be a lot of responsibility with that. It's I really think what irritates me about Yasmin Alibi Brown's attitude to this is she's putting the shame and the onus on these men as if by trying to battle for some justice are somehow being selfish. They're not trying to be a barrier to victims. They're not saying, oh, ignore victims. They're simply saying, you know, we don't want other men to go through what we went through. And it is a balancing act. Of course, there is the Savile situation, which she brought up. What we know from the Savile situation is that the establishment protected Savile for years. Savile was an evil man. He was a serial predator. And I definitely understand the need to have more transparency in situations like that, but not at the price of totally disregarding due process. And I don't think you can have a fair trial if it's trial by media. Let me know your thoughts.